whether it's a nonprofit corporation or a for-profit corporation, can, independent of candidates, talk about what they think. Which means that a C4 can now put on its website, we endorse Hillary Clinton. Or could now put on its website, if you care about the environment, Senator X is better on the issues than Senator Y. There were lots of efforts to limit that decision, and the Citizens United decision itself was actually a nonprofit organization. Efforts to limit it to nonprofit organizations, but the court went much further than it needed to. So again, Citizens United, we have a love-hate relationship with in some ways because it does allow C4 organizations, including the progressive C4s, to talk more about the issues. Now, we still can't, under federal election law, as a corporation, give money to candidates. So as a corporation, if now wanted to make a contribution to a candidate, it would need to do it through a PAC. Not because the C4s aren't allowed to, the IRS doesn't care, but because of election law. And if you want to talk more about the nuances of election law, which I feel like I sort of went down this long path, we can come back to, or call me and we can have coffee and talk about the nuances of election law. But, and that's why there are other types of organizations that are political organizations, what are often referred to as PACs. And these are entities that are also tax exempt, but tax exempt under Section 527 of the tax code. And these are entities who are built to support or oppose candidates. And PACs include a wide array. So the Republican National Committee is a PAC. The DNCC, or the DSCC, is a PAC. Bernie for America is a PAC. And so is the Now PAC. And so is Feminist Majority PAC. and they're all sort of lumped together. And what a PAC can do is it can spend, basically, as much money as it wants to support or oppose candidates. PACs are more limited in their ability to support or oppose legislation. And this is sort of a gross simplification, and if you want more, or if you can't sleep, there's in the connection, there's more information that goes into it. But this is why it's often helpful for organizations to have the whole sort of the triple play of a C3, a C4, and a PAC. Because the organizations can do different things. And organizations have strengths in different things. And some of it may be the strength in fundraising, which is where the C3 comes in, which is why some organizations that started, and maybe why now, started as a C4. The Sierra Club started as a C4, but then ultimately created a C3 because of fundraising. That there was a lot of money that they could raise as C3 dollars, and they figured, well, might as well get that money.
Yeah, but they can't pass that over to
There are ways that they can, but it needs to be done very carefully and for very specific reasons. The money can't just be funneled from one organization to another, but there are ways to transfer, to grant money. And so, again, people often will call and say, well, should we start a C4? And I'll say, well, it depends. What do you want to do? Or they'll say, we want to start a C4, but we're planning to get all our money from this foundation. And I'll say, well, then in that case, you may not want to, that may not be the best route. And so it's important to understand sort of the benefits and the drawbacks of each type of organization before thinking about what organization is right. Now, in terms of elections, if an organization really wants to get involved in elections, again, a C3 is much more limited. C3s, again, can't support or oppose candidates. So if an organization wants to endorse a candidate, it would need another type of entity. And that's even if an organization isn't spending money on it. And a lot of times endorsements, we don't really even spend money on doing so. But even if an organization wants to say, we urge people, this is the person who's most qualified to hold this office, a C3 can't do that. Now, what I will say about a C3 is that these rules apply to the organization. And they apply to all the ways that an organization can communicate. So it applies to what I might say is my role as Director of Boulder Advocacy at Alliance for Justice. It's what I say on my A. Levine at AFJ Twitter account. You can say I don't tweet a whole lot. It's what goes on the AFJ Facebook page. As an individual, however, even though I may work for Alliance for Justice, I still can have my own Facebook page. I still could have my own Twitter account. I still can have my own apartment where I can have windows, where I can put whatever I want in my windows. And so again, as a C3, it's important to recognize that these rules about what we can and can't do apply to the organization. And they apply to us in our organizational role, whether it's staff or as a board member or a volunteer for an organization. But just because you work for or sit on the board of a C3 doesn't mean your hands are completely tied. You just need to be very clear what hat you're wearing. And for many of you in this room, you wear a whole slew of hats. And it's even more important for you to be clear about what hat you're wearing at different times. And it's important for organizations that have C3s, C4s, and political arms to be really clear about what Twitter account is up when they're tweeting. And this happens every year where somebody thinks the C3 account is up and accidentally tweet something and blame the poor intern, for tweeting from the C3's Twitter account about endorsing a candidate. And we made sure last night, if we had staff live tweeting during the debate, that they were very clear about what could be tweeted from the C3's page account, what could be tweeted from the C4, and to make sure they were on the right page or the right account before you hit tweet. And that's really important. It's important for C3s in particular to have policies for staff. So you don't have staff going to meetings wearing buttons from a candidate rally that you were at last night at dinner. You know, that's okay. You can go to these events, even if you work for a C3. But you want to make sure you take off the button before you go to your C3 meeting. And again, it seems like a lot of nuances, but the more you understand that, the more you can figure out what you can do wearing which hat, the more you can do. It's for people who don't know the rules or aren't comfortable, they often will say, we're not going to do anything. Or I'm just going to say no to everything. And then sometimes people like that.
Well,
That can be a
sure,
good
Adam,
excuse. But, again, it can limit you in ways that you may not want it to. And if you have questions about that, let me know. And the more associated you are with the organization, we recognize the harder it can be to separate yourself. But it doesn't mean it can't happen. And the IRS, in fact, has been very clear that just because someone is the executive director of a C3, or just because someone is the pastor of a church, and churches are 501c3s, doesn't mean they give up all of their rights. And we have sample policies, and we can help you navigate those waters. So again, C3s can do a lot. We just need to figure out what role in what capacity. Now, C3s, again, can't support or oppose candidates. So it's very clear that a 501, and as Ellie mentioned, it's really important to recognize that while 501c3s have to be nonpartisan, just being nonpartisan isn't enough. Because we can't support any candidate. And again, as she wisely referred to, for instance, school boards. And that's often where a lot of the action is. That's often where a lot of where people start getting involved in politics. That's often where women get involved in politics at the local level. And a lot of times those local offices are not partisan. Or judicial elections. As 501c3s, we can't get involved in judicial elections, even if they're nonpartisan. And as a 501c3, we can't support a candidate who agrees with our views just because they agree with our views. So, or as a C3, they often might say, well, we want to support the woman. We don't care whether they're Republican, Democrat, Green, Independent, or we want to support the Hispanic candidate, or we want to support the new immigrant candidate, or the candidate who cares about our views on this issue. We don't care what party they are as long as they agree with us. As C3s, we can't support candidates. And the IRS uses what they call a facts and circumstances test to determine is an organization supporting or opposing a candidate. And there are some things that are very clear. So if Alliance for Justice were to say, we want, Clinton would appoint much better judges than Trump would, that is very clear that the IRS could say that could be seen as supporting a candidate. On the other hand, if we were to say, Election Day is November 8th, make sure you get out and vote, that's pretty clear that that's not supporting a candidate. And so the IRS has this facts and circumstances test where they look at what is an organization saying. Are you referring to candidates or the election? How close in time to the election? Is the issue that you're talking about something that's being discussed during the election? And they throw them all up in the air and sort of say, what do the facts and circumstances say? Sort of like using your magic 8-ball or sort of the smell test. What does it look like? And so there's some things that we know are going to be very high risk. And based on some very specific fact patterns that the IRS has gone through over the years, we'll know that I would say a C3 shouldn't do it. There are other things that we know are very low risk. So again, encouraging people to get out to vote, or helping people know about the early voting process in their state. Very low risk. Saying no to Trump, very high risk. So again, it's important for organizations to understand what these facts and circumstances are, how to apply them, and to recognize that different organizations apply them very differently. And so what one organization is comfortable putting out may not be what your organization is comfortable putting out. or just because another organization signs on to something and they say, Ellie, we signed on to it, it's okay, you can do it, doesn't necessarily mean that Ellie will be okay with it. And again, some of it depends on organization's history, some of it depends on organization's risk assessment, which may depend on an organization's board or an organization's funder. And it may also be, does an organization have an affiliated C4 and PAC? And that may sound odd, but if an organization, if a C3 is going more towards the edge, I would probably be more comfortable with that if it was a freestanding C3, as opposed to a C3 that's going to the edge that has a C4 that's endorsed a candidate. Because then it may be harder to prove it, or harder to sort of to separate it. And so, again, it's important to think about that organizations have to balance their own risk tolerance. And again, that's what my team and I have been spending a lot of time answering calls and emails of helping organizations think through that. And most of the time it can be frustrating because there is no clear answer. You know, our answer is usually, well, it depends. But we can help you understand why it depends and help think through where that risk is. And it's also important to recognize that sometimes you may want to take that risk. You know, sometimes you're going to say, well, it's worth it to us. You know, as an example, you know, we at Alliance for Justice host a fundraiser in New York every year, and we've done it for the last 4 or 5 years. And this year we are endorsing Judge Shira Schindland, who before like a week ago there wasn't a whole lot of talk about her, but she was the one who issued the stop and frisk decision. And we are honoring her in part because of her great decision in the stop and frisk decision and that the great things that it did for New York State. Suddenly Trump has started talking about that, and even he didn't mention judges last night in the during. I don't think the judges came up.
He mentioned her gender. Yes.
No, judges.
Oh.
He did not mention judges in terms of who we should appoint or the Supreme Court or issues like that, but mentioned stop and frisk. And so, some organization can say, oh, well, that's now an election issue, what do we do? We're still going to honor her. We're not going to say in the weeks before the election, she's the judge that Trump was lambasting, but we're still going to honor her. We now, will be more, it was never an election issue, it was after the election. But, some organization, if they wanted no risk at all, may say, oh, well, we're just not going to do that anymore. But that's taking no risk at all. And so it's important to think about how you balance those risks. Organizations may have, organizations often will have your senator or congresspeople come talk about what they're doing. And you may do that through, year in, year out. It may happen to be that your senator or the senator happens to be up for election. The closer, does that mean once they say I'm running for re-election, you can never have them come speak? No. But you want to think about, as a C3, how do you do it so it doesn't look like you're supporting their re-election? And timing is important. If you are having an event where your sitting senator, who's also running for re-election, speaks a week before the election, that will look more squishy, because again, the week before an election, anybody who's running for election is really going to be focusing on their election. In an invitation to the senator, you would want to address the invitation to Dear Senator X in their legislative office, whether it's their district office or their Capitol office building. And you would want to say, we're inviting you to speak as the senator for our community, as you've been such a stalwart champion of these issues, and to come talk about it. And we even recommend putting in that invitation a line saying, we recognize you're up for re-election, or, as a 501c3 organization, we cannot support or oppose candidates, and we ask you not to speak about your re-election during the event. And this actually happened a few weeks ago, and I'm not sure whether she did it for this reason, but again, Trump was speaking at a church, and he was speaking in Flint, Michigan, and I'm not sure why, but he started to go off on Hillary, and the pastor got up and
That's
said,
right.
and interrupted him and said, "We invited you here to talk about the water issues in Flint, and not to talk about the election." And he was like, "Oh." And we actually blogged about it as a great example of somebody understanding the tax rules. Whether that's why she did it, but in terms of thinking about how to do it. If you're inviting someone to, who's a senator who's up for re-election, and you don't want to work with their campaign staff. You don't want to say, what is the key issue in their election? What are they dealing with, or where could they use the most help with? And let's have them talk about that issue. You don't want to coordinate with them. You don't want to make this a way for them to promote their candidacy. But just because someone is a candidate doesn't mean you have to say, oh, no, we don't want anything to do with you. Again, we can talk through how to do that. You also want to think about how you talk about people who are up for re-election or running for re-election. So last night during the debate, we were, as a C3, we were tweeting about the debate. Were we saying, oh, what a great comment Hillary made? Or that Trump, what an ass? No. And I made sure very clearly that the folks tweeting from our C3 were not saying that. And also being very clear about who could tweet on behalf of the C3. You want to be very careful. The internet and social media is great, but we've also, it used to be where there was a press release and it went through 5 channels before it saw the light of day. Anyone can put something on Facebook. Anyone can tweet something. Sometimes as organizations we need to take more control over who does that. And so as a C3, we don't want to comment on the candidates as candidates in terms of were they good or bad. But as an organization that cares about an issue and has a track record on an issue, we can continue talking about the issues. And so or to urge the candidates to raise issues. So we could tweet about Lester Holt asks a question about the Supreme Court or about judicial vacancies. Or if they were started talking about judicial vacancies, we wouldn't want to get involved in saying, oh, Clinton was right on the money about that, or Trump was wrong on the facts. But we could tweet out, did you know there are 49, and I'm going to my colleagues will probably cringe that I don't know the right number, but there are 49 judicial vacancies, or there are 32 judicial emergencies all around the country. Putting out facts. And as we've been talking with organizations, sort of thinking about ways to keep the issue relevant, everybody knows, I think at this point, where Trump and Clinton stand on refugees. As a C3, there's more risk if we start getting involved in what are their positions on refugees and, by comparing and contrasting who's better, there's risk there. But a C3 could put out, did you know there were this many refugees resettled in the U.S. last year? Do you know that this famous person was a refugee? And sort of putting out facts that people may not know about and that people can then draw their own conclusions about. And so as a C3, again, we have to work with what we got. And we have to think about how can we use our voice and our leverage to our best advantage. And in some ways thinking about where do we want that risk? Is it worth as a C3 live tweeting during the debate if we can't really say whether the candidates are good and bad? And should we save that to our C4s and our PACs and our union friends to do that? Because the unions, the C4s, they can go crazy. They don't have to self-censor themselves or be censored by the IRS or their funders. The union can say, Clinton was right on with that. Everybody go out and elect her. And so again, some of it's thinking about who's the right voice, who's the right messenger at the right time. And that's where C4s can be really powerful. And that's where sometimes in the progressive community, the dearth of C4s on key issues can really be seen. When there's no one at the table, literally or figuratively, tweeting about or commenting on what the candidates are doing and saying. So as another example, 501c3 organizations can. And they play a really important role in hosting candidate debates and putting out scorecards. But for a C3 to do candidate debates, candidate scorecards, it's to educate the public on the issues. It's so the public can hear from the candidates in more than just sound bites. And to be able, but when a C3 has a candidate debate or a candidate voter guide, they have to ask questions on a broad range of issues, can't have leading questions, and can't connect the dots for people in terms of what does the organization think and what do the candidates think. But so a C3 in some ways, it's a way to ask candidates questions and then, but that's it. Or a C3 can encourage its members to go out and, whenever they see a candidate, ask candidates what they think about their support and whether they would support the Hyde Amendment. But as a C3, we could not then report out, well, at this event, the candidate reported, told 5 people that she would support the Hyde Amendment, and, this candidate said, I have no idea what that is. This candidate said I would do away with it. And so it's, in some way a C3 has to decide, do we want to do that or not? Is it worth it? A C4, a union, could have a candidate debate all on the Hyde Amendment if they wanted. They don't have to have a range of issues. They don't have to hide their punches and say, we support this issue, what do you think? C3s can't compare their position on an issue with the candidates. So sometimes it's thinking about who best in the community should do certain things. And by having a C4, by having a PAC, we sort of widen the opportunities. We allow us to be able, as a community, to do more. And that's where sometimes we do need to go back to one of the things Ellie mentioned right at the very beginning of, as organizations not wanting to step on each other's toes and not wanting, sometimes we do need to take a step back and recognize that our organization can't get the credit for everything. And we can't be the spokesperson for everything. And that can be hard. And sometimes it's, all right, our C3 can't say it, but so if Ellie wants to say something, she needs to make sure she's identified from the feminist majority, not by the Feminist Majority Foundation. When Nan goes out there sometimes and she wants to say something, I have to say, Nan, that's okay, you can do that interview, but you have to make sure you're doing it on behalf of AFJAC. And then we can't send out that clip to all of the AFJ list. A C3 can't disseminate what it can't do itself. So if a C3 can't endorse a candidate, we can't send out the union's endorsements or NOW's endorsements. And so it's important for C4s, and that's an issue for emerging C4s as well, that we have to start building lists. We have to start building Facebook friends and Twitter followers. And there are ways that we can buy them or trade them, but we need to have our own. And so again, we need to recognize that we may, if you're a C3, that you may not be able to talk about where the candidates stand on abortion, and that may be okay. You can still talk about referenda and the important and needing to do that. You can still talk about all the crazy bills that are going to be introduced and all the crazy rules and regulations that are being made now and fighting the litigation and doing the enforcement. And so again, as organizations, we often need to embrace what are our limits, what can we do, and recognizing that we may not be the spokesperson or the lead organization on everything, and that's okay. And we need to all figure out what our strengths are and how do we play to our strengths. And if during election season, that's a really big time, a really big piece, because we can spend a lot of time fighting, and you can spend a lot of money on lawyers. And sometimes it's really valuable to do so, pushing the line and saying, okay, we want to create a PAC now. How do we do it? And do it. And sometimes saying, you know what, we may not have enough money. If we're not going to have more than, if we're going to only have $2,000 to play with, maybe it's not enough creating a PAC at the federal level. Let's leave it to the organizations that have more money. Let's leave it to the unions. and let's use our money where we can use it more strategically.
Yeah, sounds good.
And so again, in election time, as with so many things, it's figuring out the questions of, what are our strengths? What can we do? Where is the line, and how close to the line do we get? And then, what's most strategic? As I talk to a lot of groups, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. Again, just because you should, but if you can't do something, you shouldn't do it. But just because you can do it doesn't necessarily mean you should. And it's up to, and those are much often the harder decisions of figuring out what's right for your organization. And so let me stop there and sort of open it up for questions and conversation. But again, we can speak for hours and go through all of the nuances. And we have hours worth of material on our website, whether it's the connection, talking about C4s, or being a player that talks about the rules for C3s. We have lots of publications on ballot measures, on the rules for foundations. Or if you just don't know you don't even know what you should know or what you should be asking, just call. And we're happy to talk you through that.
Thank you. What an invaluable resource.
Okay, question.
Yes, I have a question. I have been in many a church around election time when the edge is, so obvious to everyone. And I just wonder whether the IRS or any of the agents monitor those churches
They do. It's a really good question, and again, this is an area where churches are 501c3s.
That's right.
They cannot support or oppose candidates. There are two things with churches: investigating a church or higher. And so the IRS needs to meet more criteria before it can investigate and audit a church. The second, and if a church is found to have violated the rules, it can just reform and start over. But there are instances where the IRS have revoked a church's tax-exempt status or investigated a church. The other issue is that there are way more organizations than there are IRS agents. The IRS does not have enough funding to do all of the work, and so it picks and chooses. And in this political climate, it's sort of, in some ways, screwed no matter what it does. If it goes after a group, it's accused of going after them for political reasons. If it doesn't go after them, it's accused of not going after them for political reasons. And there are another area where there are groups on the right, and there are a whole bunch of churches, that even have this whole program, Pulpit Freedom Sunday, that basically taunt the IRS, come after us. And the IRS doesn't want to have a fight on these issues. One, because they don't want to defend their facts and circumstances test, and they just don't want to deal with it. And where conservative groups often sort of taunt it and push the line, where the progressive groups are like, oh no, we don't want to do anything.
Yeah.
And so it's a hard position. And so we often see that with churches.
Well, I've got a letter
Yeah.
that I got yesterday from somebody who was...
And it's unfortunate, and it's
I mean,
hard,
very-
because we often, and a lot of the lawyers that we work with, that are experts in this area, that represent these issues, that represent nonprofits, a group will call and say, well, they're doing it, what do you mean I can't do it?
Right.
And, and it's really hard, and, some of it is, it's the risk that an organization wants to take, and...
Did you know that the right wing is trying to impeach the IRS?
Oh, yes, I do know.
So they have taken on the IRS because they don't believe in the IRS, and some of them want to abolish it. So it's a serious thing.
And it's a hard position, and I think as progressives and as we've been working to try to change some of the rules, but recognizing that the IRS, has the authority to do this, there's so many issues where since they don't believe in government, they just want to say,
Right.
See, government's ineffectual, we need to just get rid of government. So.
Well, this was just right before the debate.
No, it's really
and I just
frustrating.
thought I was going to getting this letter. that have been sent out to all
It's
of
really
his,
frustrating.
many people throughout the country.
It's
This
frustrating.
was forwarded to me, by the way.
And that's why email is important, because again, and this is why, and you never know what's going to become. And for many groups, that's the struggle. And so it could be, at a church, they're sending out a letter that's basically endorsing a candidate, and there's no fuss. And then a funder might get an email that was forwarded to them where there's sort of this questionable comment that you can interpret in different ways, and they're like, oh my God, did this group break the law? What do? We need to take action. What do we do? And so people respond in very different things, and again, sort of never knowing where the media is going to. And most of the time when we deal with issues, when groups have made mistakes, it's not so much the IRS that's going to enforce it, it's somebody in the community that doesn't like the group. It's our political opponents, which is why, particularly women's groups, reproductive rights groups are so, in some ways more cautious, because we have very well-funded opponents who like spending nothing more than money on litigation and trying to force us to spend and waste resources on defending ourselves. And so for a lot of groups, it's thinking about that risk strategy, is thinking about how are we making those decisions so we keep the eye on the ball. And when sometimes people call us and say, can we invite this person who's running for election to be a speaker at this event a month before the election? I might say, yeah, you can, but is it worth it? Because do you want the focus to be on what a great event you're having, or so glad you're talking about domestic violence issues, or do you want the debate to be, should the person who's running for election be speaking at this C3 a month before the election, and are they supporting or opposing candidates? And so sometimes it's thinking about how you think the issues will play in your community and with your issues, and making the decisions based on that.
What are some of the consequences of that, like the IRS can impose on violations? I'm thinking about, and I don't want to get into a political issue, but Trump using resources of his charitable organization for personal gain, which is clearly a violation.
So there are a lot of, so the IRS has several different remedies that they can use. They can impose a fine. They can sort of provide a warning letter that basically makes a group promise never, ever, ever to do it again. Or they could revoke an organization's tax-exempt status, which for most C3s, particularly the long-standing organizations that want to be doing the work for the long run, is sort of the death knell for many organizations. It doesn't happen often. Again, the IRS does not have the resources to go after nearly as many violations as they are. There are a lot of things that are mistakes, and it's amazing where even if you look at campaign finance filings, the number of C3s that are deemed to have made contributions to candidates because somebody pays for a ticket to an event using the wrong credit card, or goes to a fundraiser and doesn't know it's a fundraiser. That happens a lot. And so it's amazing the number of sort of mistakes, or that people do things by mistake and then are so we don't, so in some way it's good that there's not this, you've made a mistake and, off with your head, because they're, and because the rules are complicated and the rules are fuzzy. No. I mean, some of it's promising never, ever, ever to do it again. Sort of you can't, and that's when we talk to groups, it's sort of like, all right, sort of what steps do you put into place to try to mitigate it from happening again. And that's why having organizational policies and educating staff and doing trainings for staff to make people aware of what the rules are really important. Being clear about who can tweet on behalf of the organization. So it's not everyone, who ever, has been to the organization. And so it's sort of putting in some of those protocols to try to limit it, and recognizing that, we're all human, and no matter how much we do, there may be something that we say that we didn't mean to say. And so it's, again, putting in the steps to try to prevent it from happening, putting in steps to try to prevent it from happening again, and then not trying to blow it up and saying, oh, we said it, well, we might as well just say it to the world now.
Okay.
One follow-up. Can you just give us an example of what, and I presume you were tweeting last night as a C3?
Yes.
What you were able to tweet as a C3 about the debate?
Sure, and I think, and I could pull them up and I can send you some sort of a follow-up, but I think we could say, hope the candidates get asked about the Supreme Court. Or, we hope the issue of abortion gets raised during the debate. Or if the candidates, again, and some of it depends on our issue. As an organization, if you start talking about, as Alliance for Justice, as I said, we focus more on sort of the process. We don't have specific positions on the minimum wage. We support many of our allies, but that's not something that we often are talking about. Or we're not talking about what we should do about ISIS. We're not talking about what we should do about, the housing crisis. And so if we were to start commenting on the housing crisis, then it might look more like, well, the only reason we're tweeting about it is because we want to sort of draw attention to how one candidate responded. And so one of the pieces that I will send, and I will send the link out, is some tips on how to respond to what candidates are saying. And again, the more your organization has a track record of talking about the issues, the easier it is in some ways to be able to respond, because then you can fact check. And you would not, as a C3, want to say, Clinton was wrong on that, or Trump was wrong, but to say, during the debate last night, the issue of the number of homelessness in America came up. We know the number is, as an organization that's been following these issues for 20 years, the number is X. Go to our website to learn more. Or, homelessness is not the leading cause of homelessness is not caused by alcoholism. It's caused by X, Y, and Z. By putting out facts.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So, very good. I think we all learned much more than we did before, and even those of us like Ellie.
Hello, I'm Jeanette Lim, and we're here for Women on the Front Line, and we're here with Abby to learn about 501c3 and C4 organizations. We have a great show for you today, so don't go anywhere.
I went to my first meeting at the White House as the Democratic leader of the House of Representatives. And I wasn't having any apprehension about the occasion because I've been to the White House many times as an appropriator, as an intelligence committee person. So I didn't even think about being apprehensive. When I went into the meeting and the door closed behind me, and I saw the President, the Vice President, and the other leaders of Congress, House and Senate, Democratic and Republican, I realized that this was unlike any meeting that any woman had ever been to before in the White House. Not only me, but any woman. But I was there with not my presence there derived from the President's appointment, but as a representative of my caucus. And as I sat down, and President George W. Bush, ever gracious and welcoming, while he was speaking, at my chair, I felt very, very closed in. Very, very closed in. I didn't know what was happening, and I could vaguely pay attention to what he was saying. And then I realized that sitting on my chair with me, Stanton, Lucretia Ma, Alice Paul, Sojourner Truth, you name it. Imagine what the President must have been thinking at the time as I was squeezing in to make room for them and others. And then I could hear him say, at last we have a seat at the table.
So in that regard, I'm interested, Abby, in knowing what a C3 organization is permitted to do.
Sure, thank you so much. A 501c3 organization can encourage people to get involved in the political process. So 501c3 organizations can encourage people to register to vote, can provide information on when the voter registration deadlines are, what kind of ID is needed to vote, and to help people understand how they can participate in the process. In addition, 501c3 organizations can host candidate forums and debates, so the public has a chance to interact with and hear from the elected officials, so they can, or the elected officials to be, so they, or the wannabes, so they can make more informed decisions.
I noticed that the Alliance for Justice has offices here in DC, in Texas, and in California. The issue of 401c3 and C4 permissible actions, do they differ in those locations, and if so, how?
Sure, that's a great question. The rules about 501c3 organizations are the same whether an organization is based in DC, in Texas, in California, or North Dakota. The tax rules apply to all organizations that are US-based nonprofit organizations as 501c3s. There are, however, differing state rules that may govern campaign finance activity, that if an organization is working on a ballot measure in California, has to comply with California state rules, or if working on a ballot measure to support or oppose a ballot measure in North Dakota, may have to file certain other forms and register in North Dakota. So the state rules, there may be some differing state rules.
I understand, Abby, today that you spoke to this clearinghouse on women's issues. Some interesting questions and some interesting information. And now, don't go away. We'll be back for more information.
On January 10th, 1917, the nation was shocked when women suffragists began to demonstrate. It was the first time a picket had ever been conducted at the White House. The New York Times described it as petty and monstrous. Others called the picketing a piece of impudence, deluded, and dangerous. The nation, one editor wrote, is shamed. For their brazen gesture, 97 suffragists were jailed for 6 months without a trial. Their arrest was eventually declared illegal, and the right to protest in front of the White House confirmed.
Welcome back. I'm here with Abby Levine with some follow-up questions. Abby, you talked about the IRS using a test, a facts and circumstances test, to determine compliance with these IRS rules and regulations. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. As I mentioned, 501c3 organizations are prohibited from supporting or opposing candidates for public office. The way that the IRS, which is the agency that oversees these rules, determines whether an organization is doing that or not is by a facts and circumstances test. They look at a variety of factors, including how close in time to the election, whether a comment refers to the election or a candidate, how controversial the issue that's being communicated about is during the election season. That was a point that I made in the speech.
Abby, you mentioned, in addition to the IRS rules and regulations, the federal election law and how that affects what groups are permissible. And you also mentioned Citizen United. Can you expand on that a little?
Sure. Citizens United was a Supreme Court decision that allowed corporations to spend an unlimited amount of money to support or oppose candidates, as long as doing so was done independently of the candidate. And what that means for us in the nonprofit world is that 501c4 organizations and labor unions, which before could endorse candidates or speak about which candidates they preferred or opposed, but could only do so to their members, now can talk about those issues to the general public.
You mentioned, Abby, that you were tweeting during the debate last night, and I was curious as to what you were able to tweet as a 501c3 organization.
It's another great question. 501c3 organizations can live tweet during debates, but we need to make sure we're really thoughtful about what we're saying.
What is the most frequent question you get about permissible activities?
During this election season, the most frequent question has been, how can we as a 501c3 organization respond to a statement that a candidate has made? And while there's always some risk when a 501c3 comments on what someone as a candidate has said, it doesn't mean they can't speak out, but they need to make sure they're talking about the issue and not about the candidate. So an organization that has had a track record talking about and working on homelessness issues, for instance, if a candidate makes a comment that's just flat out wrong about the causes of homelessness or the number of homeless children and families in their community, the organization certainly could correct the record. They would not, however, want to do so by saying Congressman X or candidate X was really stupid by saying that. I can't believe he made that comment. Everybody knows, but rather to stick to the facts and talk about the issues.
Thank you so much, Abby. We learned a lot about, in this political climate, about 501c3, 501c4, their interaction, and what is permissible for our organizations. We really appreciate you bringing your knowledge to our audience.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
What an interesting day this has been. Do you have any last thoughts?
Thanks so much for having me on. There's so much that organizations can do this election season. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at Alliance for Justice. Our phone number is 202-822-6070, or go to our website, boulderadvocacy.org. Our contact information is on screen.
Hi, this is Renee, and this is Top of the Morning, and we're here with Cindy Morgan. Hi, Cindy. So what have you have for us?
This morning we have the League of Women Voters. The SoCo Women's Network is meeting to discuss the ballot, what's on the ballot. Many of the women don't understand all the questions, the charter amendments, and so we've brought in two representatives from the League of Women Voters to help us understand these ballot questions so that we can become a more informed voter.
Cindy, what do you think the outcome will be? What do you hope it will be?
I'm hoping the women get an idea of what is on the ballot, more specifically the ballot questions, the state level and the county level, so that they have a greater understanding of what they're voting on, and that they're informed and they can make that decision prior to going into the election booth.
July 1848, Seneca Falls, New York. Nearly 300 women and several dozen male supporters, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, gather at the first Women's Rights Convention. They issue a resolution, the Declaration of Sentiments. It states all men and women are created equal and includes a radical demand for the universal right to vote. It is the first battle cry for women's suffrage, and it will be decades before victory is declared. Success will come from a brave new generation of activists who are sophisticated, savvy, and determined to make real change for women in America. Their leader is a 29-year-old Quaker named Alice Paul. March 3, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration. Thousands of women assemble at Alice Paul's urging and march down Pennsylvania Avenue. They're demanding the right to vote. It is a spectacle never before seen in the nation's capital. But as the march proceeds, violence erupts. The crowds trip, grab, and shove the marchers, shouting obscenities at them. The police refuse to intervene, and the cavalry must be called in to crush the riot. In the end, 100 people are hospitalized. But the media coverage brings this story to the national stage, exactly as organizers had planned. Alice Paul and her fellow activists have waited long enough for meaningful change. They found the National Woman's Party and are determined to do whatever it takes to achieve the ultimate goal, a constitutional amendment granting women the right to vote.